Is it really warm in there? The room? I was in front of the window, so I was sitting there and I was thinking and feeling that this is we're collectively generating a righteous heat, which no, I'm serious, which is the heat that's going to warm our bodies when we act, when we take action, so we can move with ease. So I want to thank the collective for their work on the syllabus. I think it's very appropriate that we're here to study the vision and the work of the water protectors, who are some of our most important teachers right now about how power operates on this continent, and also about the possibilities of other ways of living, other ways of organizing collective life. So I've been asked to talk about resources and infrastructure, the Dakota Access Pipeline itself as a kind of infrastructure. So I'll talk about infrastructure, what it is, like this kind of technical term, and the relationship between infrastructures and worldviews, because infrastructures always bear certain worldviews. And from there, I'll talk about some decolonial and liberatory possibilities. So to give some concrete sense of a usable understanding of the term infrastructure, I'll draw from the work of Brian Larkin, who teaches in anthropology at Barnard. And he writes that, he writes, infrastructures are the material forms that allow for exchange over space, creating channels that connect places in wider regional, national, and transnational networks. So infrastructures are material, and they're about exchange, and exchange at ever greater scales. So we could be thinking of, like wires or pipelines, channels that airplanes fly on, whatever those are called, air highways, whatever you call them. All of these things are material manifestations in the world that are about connecting. And so, for example, there's means of transportation infrastructure, like roads and railroads, airports and deep water ports. There's storage and logistics infrastructure, which are key to the contemporary, to the way power works now. Warehouses, shops, and the personnel, like dock workers. That's infrastructure as well. And infrastructure influences social life. So there are cultural and religious and economic networks that arise and change themselves in relation to changing infrastructures, in relation to these physical manifestations in the world. So infrastructures, as Larkin writes about them, are technical and cultural systems that create institutionalized structures that allow goods of all sorts to circulate, and these infrastructures connect and bind people into collectivity. So that's another, I think, really important, significant aspect of infrastructures, is that infrastructures forge collective life. An important aspect of this that I think is really useful from this way of thinking is that infrastructures are layered. New infrastructures are built over older existing infrastructures, so they're built in layers. And so these newly developed networks, like the Dakota Access Pipeline, should it be completed, which it won't be, it would not eradicate earlier. It would not eradicate earlier infrastructure that's already there, like we've heard about the dams a couple times already. But these new infrastructures are superimposed on top of existing infrastructures. Now, one of the interesting things that allows for is this historical layering over time, and you can find reawakenings of cultural, spiritual, economic forms that can be re-energized in a new situation with this layering process between infrastructures. Another thing is that infrastructures are not neutral. So none of the wires, none of the wiring, nothing is neutral. Like the pipeline has to be built at a certain gauge, at a certain thickness. All of this is debated. All of these are political choices. There's nothing neutral about it. And the infrastructure itself is not neutral. So infrastructure mediates and shapes the nature of economic and cultural flows and the fabric of social life. So the statement from the Clinton campaign, which I think came out this morning, which was this, it wasn't actually meaningless. People say that, oh, she managed to say nothing, but actually no, that's not what she said. It's this false equivalence between peaceful protest, as she defines it, and the ability of pipeline workers to continue doing their work. There's no equivalence between, there's no neutrality there, right? The ability of the workers to continue doing their work is a condition of wars and a condition of occupation and assault. So it's not a non-statement, it actually tells us a lot. So, infrastructures of settler colonialism. Most of the work in infrastructure studies looks at urban spaces. And they look specifically at post-colonial situations, newly decolonized nations in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. And of course that is not relevant to our situation here in North America. So in the case of settler colonialism, we need to think about infrastructures that are not urban, but more often rural. And more importantly, the connection points between sites of colonization. Which I think we can think of as a colonial network. I think this is a useful way to think of this. Infrastructures in settler colonialism are the built environment, the actual colonial network itself. Infrastructures are about governance, governance of populations and governance of territories. But instead of post-colonial governance, the question of how does a newly decolonized state govern itself, develop its own economy, infrastructures in North America are about the maintenance of colonial occupation. And here's that layering that Larkin wrote about in the case of North America. So the Dakota Access Pipeline is attempting to layer itself over the results, the impacts of the 1944 Flood Control Act, which dammed the Missouri River, which at the time was the largest system of dams in a single river system in the world when it was built. And almost all of the dams that were built in the system they flooded reservation lands of different branches of the Sioux Nation. We saw and heard about this several times already. So in the syllabus, the text from Michael Lawson, Damned Indians Revisited, and his earlier text, Damned Indians, can teach us a lot about that history. When I'm working in classes, one of the questions we keep returning to is this question of where is the United States? Where in the world is not like some facile thing of like, Waldo or something, but where is the United States? Not accepting the map, not accepting what the U.S. claims for itself. If we don't accept that, where can we say that the United States actually is? I think this infrastructure of colonialism is one of the places where we can see where the United States is. So for example, the no-fly zone over Standing Rock is an example. Today, that's where the United States is. Standing Rock, when there's a no-fly zone, Standing Rock is not the United States. A nation does not implement a no-fly zone over its own territory, right? So this tells us that the U.S. is in this reactive, kind of fragile position right now, instituting a no-fly zone. And this is real. I was talking with a friend who was in the air from Oregon to Illinois, where the pipeline is supposed to end. And her flight was diverted into South Dakota outside of this no-fly zone. So that's one way where we can see where the United States actually is. So infrastructures entail a whole consciousness, a whole way of relating to the world, a culture, an ideology, but really, a way of making sense of the world, the body and its relationship to the material things around it. So what are the superstructures? If these infrastructures have the infrastructures entail superstructures, right? So what are the superstructures that shape settler colonial infrastructure? Modes of imperial sovereignty, of dominion, right? One of the questions, if you study U.S. law, and this is up until the present day right now, it's a big problem internal to U.S. law to define the line that separates the military from the police, right? Foreign territory from domestic territory, and the domestic dependent nation is one of those places where the U.S. still has not figured out how to answer that. So imperial sovereignty, dominion, exclusive and exclusionary property claims, ownership for exchange, infrastructures to produce settler capital claims. So the Dakota Access Pipeline is private property. It's occurring on supposedly privately owned land. And this is kind of the excuse for this to continue happening. The corporation itself is a settler colonial superstructure. The text from Joanne Barker on the syllabus is very clear in explaining this corporation in the tribe, her essay. Corporate personhood in the US historically emerged in a context of Congress's unilateral suspension of treaty making and the development of allotment policies. It happened at this time. And she teaches us, she shows us that corporate personhood emerges over a decades-long project of establishing military and police powers of colonial occupation through the so-called Trade and Interforce Acts. So that's Barker's text, I think, is really clear in teaching us this. So settler infrastructure turns definitively away from what we might call as indigenous superstructures or indigenous ways of living in the world. Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson have been theorizing what they call grounded normativity. And this is what settler infrastructures turn away from. I've been trying to think about this in terms of indigenous relationalities, relationships organized with and through around two indigenous women. So key to indigenous superstructures is treaty protocols, the process of negotiating relations between distinct communities, which can include but precede and exceed settler superstructures of ownership, sovereignty, exchange. Chairman Archambault was here on Wednesday, and he spoke about the treaty clauses that the U.S. is supposed to provide education, food, and some enforcement of law, which is precisely what the U.S. has never provided to standing on, right? So the superstructure of settler colonialism is a turn away from the treaty. He began his talk saying that Standing Rock is standing up for the Missouri River. So here's an entirely different conception of infrastructure. The river, the planet itself, as infrastructures for life against these infrastructures of private property, right? Infrastructures of genocide, infrastructures of extinction on mass scales, which is what we're living through right now, right? So this is the false equivalence that Clinton tried to set up. So settler infrastructure turns away from indigenous diplomatic protocols. So the demand to honor the treaties is a deep theoretical political demand that can teach us a lot, but it teaches us about infrastructure, among other things. I know I'm kind of running late, but I have two things I want to say. All right, cool. The more I study history, the more I'm convinced that history does not move in straight lines. Let me talk about the Northern Pacific Railroad. Jay Cook, who was this white American man who pioneered the financial techniques that funded the U.S. Civil War and Wall Street here. And with his techniques was the origins of banks like Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs, and a few years later, J.P. Morgan. So the central institutions of Wall Street that shape imperialism in the world right now come from this. And Jay Cook is the person who innovates this. And he turned to building a railroad through northern Lakota lands in the late 1860s, early 1870s. And this railroad, the Northern Pacific Railroad, was at the center of a financial crisis that precipitated a global systemic crisis in capitalism, which historians call the Panic of 1873. This was the largest crisis in capitalism as a world system at that time. It had never had this crisis like this before. Now, the historians, the scholars who work through the archives of Wall Street, of the financial institutions, there's wide agreement among, and I'm not one of them, I haven't looked at the stuff, so I'm reading their work. There's wide agreement among them that there were internal contradictions among the banks and financial capital that led to this collapse. But the spark that led to this, the spark that led to the largest global crisis in capitalism up to that moment, was the organized, armed spiritual resistance of Lakotas and allies under the leadership of Sitting Bull and others. So I'm not saying that they're Leninists or something, but I'm saying something much more powerful. I think that the simple fact of claiming and acting on self-determination, autonomy in the lands of the ancestors of the people at Standing Rock now caused the largest crisis in global capitalism up until that moment. All right, so my last thing I want to talk about is tactics. We've seen blockades emerge in different movements in recent times. And blockades, I think, exploit the gaps, the reactive fragility, because settler colonialism is very fragile, like Donald Trump's ego. The reactive fragility of settler and racial infrastructures. So there are connections that are made between Sacred Stone Camp and Black Lives Matter and decolonization movements and liberation movements in Palestine. And these are infrastructures that move at larger and larger scales, but draw different types of networks, different types of connections. These are infrastructures, struggles. Just a few days ago, there were people blockading George Washington Bridge, right? Yeah. Migrants. So these are struggles that connect rural and urban spaces, calling into question fundamental aspects of governance right now. I think we can see these blockades as doors to different futures. And we can study, as we study, work our way through the syllabus. One of the questions for us to study is, what is the infrastructure of the camp itself? Thanks.